share. I'm going to share my screen.
Amazing. Yeah, and in the meantime, while you're pulling that up, everyone feel free, per usual, drop in your LinkedIn in the chat. Feel free to drop in any questions that you have for Matthew and Brooke about the important work that they're doing, and really just anything that comes up. Our chat's open for everyone. So thanks, Matthew.
Yeah. All right. So a little bit about Revel once it loads. So our whole mission is really just life without limits and being the bridge to adulthood for people with neurodiversities so that they can go ahead and lead meaningful, enriched lives with the idea that it's a life without limits. I don't know if y'all are seeing this on your end. Are you seeing this bar?
Yeah, we're able to see it. Looks great.
Okay, okay, perfect. All right. So one of the things that we are really going to focus on is what exactly are our learning targets for this? So this presentation is all about what are accommodations, how can we request them, what does the full kind of life cycle look like for someone who maybe just is needing some assistance in the workplace. So the key concepts that we're going to look at are accommodations, disclosure, undue hardship, partial disclosure versus full disclosure, the different accommodation types, and the effects of disclosure on accommodations. And then we'll wrap that up with essentially how to make that request. So, one of the first things that we're going to talk about is what are inclusive hiring practices. So, they're basically just intentional, systematic approaches that are designed to create an equitable and fair experience for all candidates throughout the recruitment, interview, selection, and offer stages of employment. Now, the primary goal of inclusive hiring practices is essentially just to provide equal opportunities for candidates from diverse backgrounds. So it's focusing more on skills and qualifications to build a more representative and high-performing workforce through intentional supportive structures, sometimes called reasonable accommodations. And the way that you kind of unlock access to these reasonable accommodations are through disclosure. Now, disclosure is essentially just letting your employer know that you have a disability that may affect how you work, and then letting them know kind of what support you might need to help you do your job well. And you can do this a couple different ways. So you can go full disclosure, which is essentially just providing all of your information, the name of a disability or diagnosis, how it affects your work, and what supports you need. Some people like this because it essentially just puts all your cards on the table and it can lead to more quick outcomes, essentially. It can also reduce stress by just kind of giving your employer all that information so that you don't have to kind of remember like what pieces you've provided them. Whereas in partial disclosure, you really only share what's needed and you kind of focus on the how you're going to do your work and not necessarily the why you need assistance to do your work. So yeah, when we're looking at partial disclosure, you really can have it be as simple as possible of just like, hey, I'm experiencing this and I think this could help me get there. And yeah, basically the reason that someone might choose partial versus full disclosure is privacy. Privacy is a big concern. So some people don't want to provide that to their employer, and that is totally okay. That is their choice. Many people choose partial disclosure because they want to keep their medical or personal information private, and it still allows you access to those reasonable accommodations. The big thing here that I really want to stress is that there is no right or wrong choice with what type of disclosure you decide to move forward with your employer. What matters is that you feel safe and comfortable and empowered to make that choice. So once we've gone ahead and provided disclosure, essentially it unlocks access to accommodations. And accommodations are basically just different adjustments, supports, or modifications that are designed to eliminate barriers and ensure that every employee can participate and succeed in their role. So they provide individuals with different needs, such as those related to a disability, medical condition, or religious belief, with equal access to all job duties, programs, and opportunities. So some really common ones that I'm sure y'all are somewhat familiar with are electronic support devices. So that's something like a screen reader or even like a voice to text machine. So, using your smartphone and speaking into your smartphone, that can be an accommodation. Offering flexible scheduling for medical appointments or adjusting the physical workspace with an ergonomic chair. Those are also examples of reasonable accommodations. One thing I really want to stress is that accommodations are not special treatment. They are practical tools that help people perform their roles effectively by addressing their unique needs. So some considerations when, some considerations when asking for an accommodation are going to be job relevance. So this accommodation needs to help you complete the main job tasks that are associated with your role. Reasonableness. So it should be a practical, safe, and not overly difficult tool for the employer to provide through creating an undue hardship. And process needs. So the employer may check resources and ask for brief documentation to find the right support. So one thing about an undue hardship that's kind of thrown around a lot, that term. So it's basically just a significantly difficult or expensive tool that an employer would provide as an accommodation. So we want to look at something that is not going to be overly difficult for the employer to provide or overly expensive. And it is determined on a case-by-case basis. Some considerations when we're looking at accommodations are accommodation cost, the employer's overall financial resources, the business size and type, and the impact on operations. And typically, larger companies are expected to handle greater costs than smaller, maybe individually owned businesses. So an example of an unreasonable request versus maybe a reasonable request would be someone is having difficulty focusing at work. So a reasonable accommodation for that might be something like noise canceling headphones. It could be something like a request to move their work location from a busy area. Maybe their desk is next to the water cooler or next to the kitchen, and they want to be moved to a quieter space to help with focus. That would typically be a reasonable accommodation. An unreasonable accommodation might be something like requesting your private office if it's a shared business space that you have. Or it could be something like requesting remote work if a large portion of your role responsibilities are in person. So when we're looking at accommodation types, they can be kind of broken up into three main categories. That's going to be communication and task structure modifications, environmental adjustments, assistive technology, and scheduling flexibility. And as we go through these, I'm sure y'all are going to be familiar with them, but I definitely think it's good to go through. So some communication and task structure modifications, those are basically like simplified alternative communications, job restructuring, and then modified supervision and support. So simplified and alternative communication, that can be something as simple as a visual aid, a checklist, written step-by-step instructions, offering demonstration or modeling of new tasks when you're going through that learning stage, allowing instructions to be given in smaller segments, providing visual supports or alternative methods of communications like a notepad. When we're looking at job restructuring, that is something where you would need to partner with your employer to potentially break down larger assignments into smaller, more defined tasks. It can also be something like reallocating non-essential job duties to another position if they present a significant barrier. Another aspect of this is also going to be through training. So your employer should provide you additional training time for new responsibilities or skills. And then when we're looking at that modified supervision and support, this is one that I personally lean into a lot. This is something where your employer might provide more frequent structured check-ins to prioritize tasks and offer constructive feedback. This also is where I come in as a job coach, and this would fall under allowing the use of an on-site or remote job coach for initial training and ongoing support. Now, the next type of accommodation is going to be an environmental adjustment. And this is going to be something that focuses on noise reduction or visual distraction control. So when we're looking at like the headphones, that would be something that would provide noise reduction. It could also be something like the use of a white noise machine or a noise canceling machine. For a visual distraction, it's going to be those listed there, like a desk shield or relocation of workspace. And then the third type of accommodation is going to be based on assistive technology and scheduling flexibility accommodations. So when we look at this, it's going to mainly be schedule adjustments and then assistive technology. And schedule adjustments, that can be something along the lines of maybe it's a modified break schedule. So in the state of Colorado, which is where we are, you are entitled a 10-minute break for every 4 hours that you work and a half-hour unpaid break for anything over that up to 8 hours. If it was a client that I was working with who needed a modified breaking schedule, something that we might approach is instead of a 10-minute break, can we look into 2 5-minute breaks? Or can we look into potentially 3 5-minute breaks if it does not create that undue hardship for the employer? When we're looking at flexible break times, that also can be something around medical appointments, right? So allowing for a flexible schedule to manage fatigue or medical appointments. And then when we're looking at assistive technology, this could be something as simple as a calculator, providing voice input software, providing a watch or a device to help with schedule management, and then maybe some additional training or support around, establishing a color-coded organization system. Now, when I was trying to think about like how we might explore this and kind of see it working in action, I thought that the best example we could do is just working with a fictional character. So I'm going to introduce you to our new friend, Chris. Chris is starting a new job, and they've decided that they would like to disclose that they've been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. They are unsure how to approach their new employer, an IT service provider. So when they're doing this, they could go ahead and, consider partial disclosure, where they, just kind of have a very casual conversation with their employer about, some of the struggles that they're facing in work or some of the challenges that they're facing in work related to their diagnosis. Their employer, might let them know like, hey, let me connect with our HR team and I'll get back to you. And they may ask for additional documentation. The main difference between that full and partial disclosure essentially is in the timeliness of those accommodations being put into place. Full disclosure is going to essentially streamline it and provide your employer all the information that they need to essentially be legally responsible to provide a reasonable accommodation. A partial disclosure is essentially going to give that information to your employer, but they might not have the receipts that they need to be forced legally to provide those accommodations. The end of that full cycle, whether it's full or partial disclosure, is the same. You as an employee are entitled to a reasonable accommodation. All right, so jumping back into this, Chris could provide partial disclosure, and the reasonable accommodations that they might come up with are going to be, maybe more opportunities to practice communication or desensitization, more frequent check-ins, or relocation to a quieter work area if possible. Now, some reasons that people might choose partial disclosure is that they may have a fear of stigma or stereotypes associated with their disorder or associated with their diagnosis. Employees can sometimes fear about being judged or stereotyped or facing professional consequences if their employer knows their diagnosis. They might have privacy concerns. They might, be a little bit nervous just to even talk to their employer about this. So they may choose the partial disclosure because it reduces that burden of proof and it focuses on functionality. So it focuses on kind of the how are we going to complete these tasks rather than, this is my diagnosis and this is how it impacts how I complete these tasks. Now, on the other side, they could provide full disclosure and, seek employer support to be successful in their role by requesting and attending a meeting with their employer and through providing supporting documentation. Now, when they provide supporting documentation, their human resources department or their operations team may come back with, a ton of different options. Essentially, it's just going to give them a lot more information to work with to kind of draw from what might be successful for Chris in the long run. Now, someone might choose full disclosure because it accesses those accommodations in a more timely manner. It also provides certain legal protections. So disclosure invokes rights under the Americans with Disabilities Acts and it helps protect against discrimination. It can also reduce stress and energy. So sometimes if you as an employee don't provide full disclosure, it can get kind of tricky remembering what exactly you told your employer or what aspects of your diagnosis you told your employer you might need support with. So for that reason, some people do choose full disclosure. It also may provide reasons for previous performance issues. So if for some reason your diagnosis impacted your previous work performance and that came up, giving your employer kind of this lens to view your previous performance through can be really helpful and shed some light on where those opportunities may lie. Now, Chris has identified some helpful accommodations and has gone ahead and decided to provide full disclosure. Now, he has gone ahead and requested a modified break schedule, on-site job coach support, and environmental noise reduction. Now, some employees can benefit from taking their breaks at different rate than what may be considered standard by their employer. And this could be to accommodate different conditions, symptoms, and habits they have in order to perform their job at an optimal level. On-site job coach support. So job coaches are essentially just individuals who specialize in assisting individuals with disabilities to learn and accurately carry out their job duties. We provide one-on-one support and training tailored to the needs of the employee while also meeting the needs of the employer. So how that might work is we might go ahead and do a job analysis to identify the job duties, followed by developing a specific plan as to how we can go ahead and best train the employee to work more and more on their own until they're completely self-sufficient and able to perform job duties accurately and effectively without assistance. And that third piece, environmental noise reduction. So environmental sound machines, also known as sound conditioners, help block out extraneous noises that are often found to be distracting. So this can be a way just to kind of control those distractions through noise. So what do we think our next step is if we have identified accommodations and we have identified where we want to be, what type of disclosure we want to provide? What do you think the first step is to making this request?
And feel free if people want to interject or throw things in the chat, whatever feels most comfortable.
Yeah. And sorry, I just saw these questions.
Looks like reaching out to HR. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say the first thing that you can do is request a meeting, right? So when we're looking at the steps that we want to do, we want to request a conversation. We want to put that request in writing. So that can be in an email. And then we want to document the reasonable accommodation request, basically because that protects you, but it also kind of acts as a way to keep your employer accountable, right? So it creates a paper trail that supports the accommodation. And the first thing that you would want to do when you are making this request is reach out to your supervisor or your HR representative to request a meeting. You want to attend that meeting, and then you want to follow up on those accommodations. I would say just a recommendation that I would have if you are requesting an accommodation, one that I might include just regardless are those additional check-ins. I think they're really helpful just as a temperature gauge for how you are doing in the role, for how the employer perceives you doing in the role, and it kind of creates a productive communication channel for all parties. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop this presentation. Or sorry, at least jump into where I can see you all.
And we can start opening up for question and answer, and then we'll wrap up with giving you guys opportunity again for that QR code to give us feedback on the information in today's presentation. But we can either jump into chat questions, or if people want to ask us them and unmute, that's great as well.
I'll jump in to ask y'all a few of the questions that we got in the chat throughout. So James flagged that he joined a little bit late, but he's curious, is Revel only a Colorado thing or organization, nonprofit? And also curious about if there's any impact on Revel given our current political climate.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So Revel is based in Denver. However, we are not only serving individuals in Denver, so we do provide virtual services, so we're able to support past Colorado. Unfortunately, we are impacted by current state. The largest impact that we've had is on our different funding sources. We do receive a fair amount of grant funding as a nonprofit, and with some of those restrictions around DEI at a federal level, it has created a lot more competition at the state level. So we've seen significantly less funding with grants, and then have also been impacted by some of the government shutdowns affecting our other funding sources. So yes, unfortunately, we have.
Well, we have another question that came through too that's hopefully a little bit more in line or more positive. Actually, more curiosity for me. I'm curious if, given your nonprofit status, if angel investing is something that has been explored or even available for nonprofits.
I'm not positive on that.
That might be an interesting funding revenue. But moving back into candidate questions, James H. reached out and asked, at what point in the hiring process is it prudent to disclose? A lot of people hiring for positions may identify as self-diagnosed and might not technically fall under ADA.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a question that comes up a lot in just our coaching sessions. And I would say there is no wrong time to disclose. Again, it kind of ties into the type of disclosure. What matters most is you feeling confident in providing that disclosure. Yeah, so I would say there's not really any right answer. I would say when it feels comfortable for you or when you feel that you might need that extra assistance, that's when I would make the accommodation.
Yeah, and something to add on to that as well is, it can be a difficult decision. And, things can come up of, I'm concerned that there's going to be bias if I disclose my disability before I have the role. And, that could certainly unfortunately happen, and you wouldn't know if that was the case, or maybe, they just went with someone who was more qualified. You don't really know that. I would say advice that we give a lot of our clients are, when you feel like you would benefit from an accommodation. So let's say you would benefit from an interview accommodation, like receiving the interview questions ahead of time, or extra time for your interview, or space to be able to stand up. If you're feeling like that is important for you and getting that role, then it might be smart to disclose ahead of time. Obviously, personal choice and weigh your options. But if you don't feel like you need that in the interview process, and you're not sure how inclusive the employer is, and you kind of want to feel it out, then maybe wait until you have the job. Or some people like to wait until they've gotten situated in the job and decide, do I really need accommodations? Would that help me perform better? So really personal choice, but biggest thing I like to recommend people consider is, at which point would you benefit from those accommodations, and then start thinking through that.
Really, really great advice. And we got another question kind of in the same vein. Do you recommend disclosing in something along the lines of a cover letter, or maybe during specific interview stages? I know you mentioned it's a personal choice, but I think folks are just trying to land on like where most get that success in disclosing.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that it's relevant. So, if it feels important to you in terms of making sure an employer understands you and your identity, then that could be, within that relevant line. But also, if we're putting it in a cover letter, everything in your cover letter should be relevant to the job that you're applying for, and why you're a qualified individual and can do that job well. And there's a lot of reasons why you being neurodiverse would help you do that job better. So if it's in a way that's a positive lens, and hey, this is relating directly to the function of the job, and my autism, for example, would help me do this job even better, and it's important that you know my identity, then that's great. But again, if you have concerns about the employer being inclusive and you're feeling on the fence, it's totally fine to wait until after you've secured the job before you move forward with that disclosure.
Just so much phenomenal advice here. Thank you so much, Brooke. I'm gonna move us into another question. One shared with us that he's been struggling a little bit with his Tourette's. It's been acting up as of late. So just curious on how he might be able to, or we might be able to look for an employer that has a history of hiring neurodivergent folks, or where they might be able to source those more inclusive employers?
Yeah, so with the inclusive employers, I would say a good place to start could be looking at Neurodiversity Chamber of Commerce and seeing businesses will sign up as an inclusive employer. There's different networks that you can look into, kind of depends what state you're in as well. But I would look into employer networks that have something around inclusivity, and that can be a good place to start. Also checking out people's websites, looking, do they highlight that they support different organizations or different causes, or do they have giving back in different ways? That can be a way to kind of feel things out. You can also reach out to employers and inquire about the role. You can do informational interviews. There's a lot of ways to kind of temperature check on an employer. Unfortunately, sometimes you got to just jump in and apply and feel it out in the interview, but those would be some good places to look.
Amazing. And then in terms of, and Matthew might be able to speak to this a little bit as well for us, but what is supporting documentation? James shared that when they received their diagnosis, they were given a pretty comprehensive summary. So they're curious, should they go back to a doctor or receive like a formal letter of diagnosis that might just dilute that down a little bit, to share only what's necessary?
Yeah, so honestly, that letter can be as simple as connecting with your service provider, and they can write a letter that states this this client has a diagnosis or disability covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this is how it might impact their work. So they don't even need to disclose the name, they don't need to disclose the diagnosis. What they would need to know is that from this medical service provider, that they are protected under the ADA Act, and that how that diagnosis might impact their work.
Yeah, and if you are choosing that you want to provide more information, then that can be included. But you have a lot of different options. And like Matthew stated in the presentation, it's a personal choice and there's absolutely no right or wrong answer. So if you want to protect your privacy and, for whatever reason, then you get to decide how much you're offering to that employer. Now, the side of that maybe could be less appealing is that depending on how many or how much information you provide, that can affect what reasonable accommodations the employer is obligated to give you, depending on level of disclosure. So there's, some pieces that go in there, but you can always start with partial disclosure and not giving that much information. And then if it's not getting you to where you want to be, you can always add more.
Amazing. And then we have some folks that were curious about the duration of vocational rehab and the support that Revel might be able to provide. Could you share a little bit about what that might look like with your current folks?
Yeah,
Yeah.
or you can go ahead,
I
Matthew.
was gonna say it, so we don't go based off of a benchmark of, we're with you for 3 months and then like sayonara, bye-bye. Like that's just not our model. That's not how we work. What we are looking for is stability in the workplace. And typically, once you've reached stability in the workplace, which that could mean establishing communication channels with natural supports and mastery of assigned duties. When we're looking at job stability in the workplace, we're looking for that to be maintained for typically a period, anywhere from 1 to 3 months for stability. So that means you are crushing it in the role, like feel super confident, and then we kind of bittersweetly take the step back and let our clients be independent based upon what they're letting us know.
Yeah, and that question I wonder if they're also asking about like vocational rehabilitation funding. Revel is a vendor for vocational rehabilitation. And so they do have some different timelines that we have to follow if somebody is funded by that funding source. So that can impact things. Revel as an organization and how we like to support individuals. We don't like to follow all those timelines and we like it to be an individualized process, but Sometimes we do have to operate in some more restrictions, and that's going to depend on, the state and what funding is available, and their different restrictions there.
Dave also asked how you support, and maybe I know you shared the case study of Chris, but maybe grounding it in one individual experience might be an interesting case study to share. But how do you move away from sort of compliance-based models towards self-advocacy and having that like confidence and ability really to advocate for yourself in a way that might feel uncomfortable?
I mean, I think that's kind of, the bread and butter of really what we do is we do try to empower our clients and kind of center their voices throughout the job coaching process. So depending on the client, it could be something where we go through personal achievement training, where we focus on communication skills and where we focus on professional communication. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking for the question so that I can read it because my visual definitely helps me out.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit to that as well. I think a powerful way that you can shift from it being a very formal conversation, here's my diagnosis, this is what accommodations I want, and now you're legally obligated to provide me with these things, is, focusing on that relationship with your employer and having it be more of an open conversation. You may request accommodations and they might not be a super good fit. Maybe you thought that just relocating your desk was going to do it for you, and it's, still a distracting area. So making sure that you're setting it up as a continuous conversation of, hey, I care a lot about being successful in this role, and the job that I do is important to me, and these are the things that are going to help me be successful. And I would love to keep this conversation open. So then you can go to your employer and say, hey, I have another idea of how I can be more successful, and focus it in that way, and really advocate for what you need to do well at your job. Because at the end of the day, your employer wants you to do a good job, and that can be a really good connecting point.
Really, really great notes. We got another question from John about navigating bias, and when that does exist, how do you sort of move through those opportunities? And maybe even, John, I'll add this to your question. How do you keep your head above that water when sometimes it does feel like we're constantly, maybe there's a lot of rejection in the job search process and bias. How do you keep your head above in that space?
I think one of the most successful things that I've seen, and I think like it does tie into an accessibility piece. If you have the means to be able to volunteer or to be able to engage in similar work, maybe in a part-time status while you're seeking a more preferred full-time role, I've seen that be really successful for clients who are experiencing kind of that burnout of just, slugging through applications. The job hunt, just as a process, is exhausting, or it can be exhausting. So sometimes just reconnecting with what about your job or what about this industry you really love, that can be reinvigorating, and it can help create different professional networking opportunities. That's one thing that I would say is really helpful is if you have any sort of local neurodiverse networking communities, join them, go to them, meet your community, meet your neighbors.
Yeah, and dealing with that bias can be really difficult as well. So, on this topic of disclosure and accommodations and all of those pieces, like we talked about, do what feels right to you. Choose your time that feels comfortable to disclose. If you are feeling like there's bias in the hiring process, focus more on those employers that have clearly stated that they are inclusive, or, just different areas there. And like Matthew said, connecting with your network can be very empowering and helpful in so many ways. And seeking out support through job coaching services too, and having somebody that can help you navigate these more individual situations and bounce ideas off of can be really helpful as well.
Such phenomenal advice. I know we're wrapping up our time together, but I wanted to flag one last question that we got from Elizabeth about managers or HR pushing against asking for accommodations. If you have any recommendations there, or kind of maybe even educating about what accommodations could mean for someone might be an interesting conversation, but I'm curious about what y'all recommend candidates in that space.
I would say if you're receiving pushback from your employer that the accommodation is not reasonable, I would encourage you to have a meeting with someone that you trust and that is going to be an advocate for you during this process. As a job coach, I've done this with my clients, like side by side with them. And yeah, I would say, have that meeting to discuss like what a reasonable accommodation is that they're willing to offer and potentially look into, is that considered reasonable or unreasonable because of the size of the business. Again, like those smaller organizations and smaller teams aren't going to have the same resources as larger teams. So it could be something of just having that collaborative discussion of like, hey, like the issue that I'm dealing with is, it's hard to focus, in this environment. How can we improve this? Like what tools are at our disposal? So I would say definitely, practice the conversation. I would write down the key points that you want to make, and I would go into a meeting that you've requested with someone that you trust who can, kind of be there as a support for you during that process.
Yeah, another thing I'll add too is unfortunately accommodations, a lot of employers have a negative connotation with that word of this is going to be extra work for me, or this is an extra burden on the employer. And so I think if you can go into that conversation and shift it to this positive lens of like what I was talking about before, hey, I care about doing well at my job, and here are the ways that I think I could do better. And framing it in this positive lens or framing it in a collaborative way of hey, I would love to discuss some ways that I can improve in this area, and focusing on that growth, the success, and shifting it away from hey, I am disclosing, now you're legally obligated and I deserve this and this, of hey, this is what's going on. I care about my job. I care about doing well. Can we have a conversation around this and figure out some ways where I can feel more supported? It really shifts the way that conversation can go.
Amazing. Well, this has been so amazing. I say it for myself, like I feel like I've learned so much about accommodations, even as someone who's had to ask for them multiple times. It's been so exciting to learn from you both and the amazing work that y'all are doing over at Revel. So first, thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and for supporting neurodivergent community, because it gives all of us so much more hope just to see how passionate you both are and willing to take time out to really share with us all of the amazing learnings that y'all have had too. So I guess next question is, how can folks stay in touch with you both and maybe continue communications if there's any area that they need support in?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share emails, and we also have info email for Revel as an organization. Revel does provide a variety of services. So employment program is only one of 6 of our different programs and how we support the neurodiverse community. But we can share contact information. Would love to stay in communication with individuals. And if anybody is seeking job coaching support, like I said, we're not limited to Colorado, and would love to find out more ways that we can support this wonderful community.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Brooke and Matthew. Matthew dropped his email into the chat, y'all. So, and
Yeah.
then we also have oh, sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
Well, I was gonna say, I'm working on putting that QR code in there, and yes, I will have that in there in one moment.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. We'll also be sending along a recording of this session after, so y'all will also have their information to contact them directly with any questions. And when in doubt, I'm also going to drop my email. In case it's not saved, feel free to reach out, anyone and everyone. Thank you so much again, Brooke and Matthew, for the work that you're doing and for meeting us here. And Yeah, excited to see what y'all will do in 2026.
Same. Keep us in mind. I just am rooting for all y'all. The process can be the worst, but once you find a good spot, it's the best.
Yeah. And doing it not alone always makes us, brings us together. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining and stay in touch, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Yeah, bye,
Bye.
y'all.